just got the finger, so I guess I'm back on the air. I want to give a plug to one of the stores I like here in town, and it's Do It Best Pahrump Rentals and Hardware. And I always look at their ad when they send it out. I look for the deals. And I have to say, this is a store that's been here a long time. A store like Floyd's Ace Hardware was here for 40 years. And when Home Depot came in, the competition was just too much and they shut down. But Pahrump Rentals has survived. And I was in the store recently. My God, they've got a huge selection of stuff. And it's not like you have wide aisles and everything. They've packed a lot of stuff in there. You can go in there at times and you won't find it anyplace else, but you'll find it there. And one of the things that attracted me this time was they had 50 feet of reinforced vinyl garden hose for $10. Well, I happen to need some garden hose. But when you go in there and you look around, you find out that's the only place in town I know of you can buy 3/8 inch barbed fittings for drip tubing. So anyway, I just want to give a shout out to the folks at Pahrump Rentals. They've always given me a fair shake, good store to work with, and nothing against Home Depot, but I do like the small town stores. And it's got that small town feeling, you know. I can remember as a kid, I used to go in the hardware store in Master Beach, and they had all these little drawers with all these screws and things that you had to get. And in a little town, for them to have everything was amazing to me. And that's kind of what Pahrump Rentals is like. And they have rental equipment. So it's not just a hardware store. You can go in and rent equipment to do certain jobs you might normally hire a contractor to do and pay several $1,000s. You can rent it there for maybe $250 or $500 or whatever you're going to do. So these are good. Well, I'm done talking about Joe Biden today, mainly because he was so boring during his first hearing with the press. There was nothing to learn from what that guy had to say. And I want to go on to something else here. Let me see where it is. I'm looking. Oh yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit. I used to do a garden class here in Pahrump. And in that garden class, the way it was set up was, it was 1 hour every week. It was a freebie. So I had about 18, 20 people would show up. And it was every week I would do a class. And it would last for an hour. And the reason I made it that way is I got to thinking about it. Now, I took the Master Gardener class, and I was a Master Gardener, actually held my title for a couple of years. But I got the idea that sometimes you get so much information at once that you lose track of what you should be doing during the year. Even if you have a calendar with what to do, not everybody looks at the calendar or anything else. So the idea behind the class that I did was every week, starting in January, I would talk about a specific issue that you should deal with at your garden that week. Now, we live in a rural community. So if you're watching this show in another state, maybe in a city, some of it may apply to you. But when you live in a rural community like Nevada, and here actually, we're in the desert, and it's different here. It's not like living anyplace else. Desert living is different than having a garden. And there are different plants and different altitudes. All of this comes into play. So the first week, I would always talk about soil, the soil here in our town. And my son tells me it's sandy. And I respect his opinion. But the reality is, it isn't. When you disturb the soil here, if you go to a construction site and you walk on the dirt while they're working and bringing in equipment and what have you, the soil can be like powder, almost worse. You can actually sink down 3 or 4 inches into the soil. It gets so powdery. And it's a problem in the desert dust itself. So my first class would be about the soil in the desert. And believe me, when I first moved here, I had no clue. People told me, if you plant it, it'll grow here. And to some extent, that's true. But the soil here is clay. I mean, for the most part, it's clay. They actually, in Pahrump, they used to have an adobe brick manufacturing facility. I found about this from a fellow named Charlie Nyberg, who's a very interesting guy. He was the original well driller in 1960. And Charlie has a house that's built with those bricks. I was visiting him one day and I looked and I'm thinking, gee, he's got a brick house. But really it was adobe. Really nice. Anyway, so you can actually make bricks here out of the soil because it's clay. And if you dig down, depending on where you dig on your property, it can get so hard you want to get a 6-foot heavy bar with a blade on the end to break it up to make it easy to dig. Really, that's the best way to dig it. So as a gardener, I talk about soil, and my first recommendation is you should not put your plants directly into clay soil. You have to change the consistency of the soil. And you do that by adding compost, by adding material, maybe some sand, whatever it takes to loosen up that soil. You can't just dig it with a rototiller. That's not a good idea. But once you've changed your soil to the point where it should be, where the plants will be happy to grow in it, then it works. So we would discuss the various aspects of that. And I can tell you from personal experience with the people in the class that they told me they were here for 2-3 years and they didn't have success with their gardens. They didn't take a master gardener course and they had problems in figuring it out. Now I can tell you the first year that my son did a garden here, even though he thinks the soil is sandy, but he did modify the soil. And I have people here that would have covers over their plants to protect them. My son never did that. But every morning and every evening he went out and checked his garden, made sure it had proper water, and he looked for bugs. We never put up shade cloth or anything. And he had we used to go to the farmer's market and bring our surplus there. We had so many Roma tomatoes, we were cooking up the Romas, cooking them down and making tomato sauce out of them for spaghetti and what have you. So the whole class would be strictly on soil. And we have a thing here in the desert called caliche. When you hear about, well, first off, let me go back to the clay for a second. The clay itself, when it's dry, it's hard. But if you drive equipment like a tractor or a truck or things and you drive over it regularly, it softens up and it gets powdery. It breaks up. And that layer, you have to do something about it. But below that layer of soil is another layer called caliche. Now, the first layer, when it gets that's why they call it poof dirt. It gets poofy. And it gets powdery, and it gets on everything. It gets in the air. It gets on your clothes. You can't walk in it. If you get black shoes and you walk through it, they'll be covered in dirt color. And below that is another layer. And let's say 5 feet down, I'm going to use that as a number, but it varies throughout. If you went 5 feet down and you laid down a layer of concrete. Concrete is not cement, by the way. If you laid down concrete, it would be impenetrable to water. Well, basically, that's what caliche is. It's a conglomerate of stone and calcium buildup. And I want to tell you, if you lift it up or you try to dig through it, that stuff is tough. So at my first class, I would bring in a piece of caliche so they could see what it was like, what we're talking about. Because in your mind, you have a vision, but you got to feel it to truly understand. Now, when you see caliche, and you understand why you have to do something about gardening in the desert. And in the desert, the other issue when we talk about the soil is how dry the soil is. You know, the humidity in the air here in the desert can be as low as 3%. 3% humidity. It sucks the water right out of your skin. Think of what it does to your plants. And during the weather when your plants are growing, unless it rained, unless you had a thunderstorm, which does happen sometimes, if you're lucky, you'll get humidity up around 40, 50%. Now, if that soil dries out, then the plants are just going to kick the bucket. That goes for your trees. It goes for the soil. You got to make sure the soil is at least always got water getting down to the plants. And one of the demonstrations we did with soil was we take a jar and we dig up soil from your house and you bring it into the class and you put some water in the jar and you wait 24 hours and you can see that what settles in the jar. I won't tell you about that on the radio because it's a visual, but it tells you what's in your soil. It tells you how much organic mineral is in, organics are in it, how much clay is in it, how much silt, how much small gravel is in there, and you can actually see it settle out. And you know the funny thing about that? In life, the big things always work their way to the top. If you eat popcorn, the big popcorn is always on the top, and the small pieces filter to the bottom. It's no different here. The earth is always moving. So gradually, as a matter of fact, if you have no rocks in your yard, one day you'll walk out there and you'll find some rocks. Where did they come from? They came down below and they worked their way up to the surface. When they used to put tires, back in New Jersey, when they had these big landfills, they were putting tires in them and covering them over with dirt. Eventually the tires had worked their way to the surface. So anyway, so in the first class we talk about soil. I'm not going to get into any more than that I just told you about. And then the second we would talk about your tools. And one of the issues is your tools need to be sharp. And what kind of tools can you get? And where do you use your tools properly? And what can you expect out of your tools? Even where do you shop for good tools? And does a good tool have to be expensive? I mean, we're into all these things. So every week it was a different thing. So by the time we got into composting on one class, we got into repurposing things in another class, but it was every week. And so I would encourage people coming to the class that week they should do this. So it wasn't like you get overwhelmed when it comes time to actually put plants in the ground. And then sometimes we would share things. I would learn things from other people in the class. One fellow from England told me about, that you tend to wound some of these plants, you wound the bottom of the stem, so that's where the roots will grow. And in some ways they just skin it. But this guy, he said his mother used to whack it with a hammer and stick it in the ground. That was the wounding process, and it worked. So, well, anyway, I have this garden book in front of me here, and I like to go to the library. This book came out of Reader's Digest, and it's 1,001 hints and tips for your garden. Now, I don't really care much about plants that just look pretty. If I'm going to have a plant, I'd like it to look nice, but I also want it to give me something back in repayment for the fertilizer, the composting, the time, the money. I want to get something back. So I look for plants that do that. I like plants that come back every year. As a matter of fact, one of the things I talked about in the class was when does a plant come into play during the season? And I have all these little tips. I'll give you a little example. We had 3 peach trees in our yard, and one of the peach trees came in early. Now, we didn't plant it this way. We just got lucky. But one of the peach trees came in early, and we got peaches. And then, like a month later, another peach tree started producing the peaches. And then another month, and the third one started producing peaches. Well, I learned down the road that I shared with the class that depending on the type of peach, they can come in at different times. And what they used to do in the old days, they would set several varieties of peaches so that they would have them all summer long. Well, they didn't do it just with peaches, other fruit as well. Apples were a big deal. You know, apple cider, apple vinegar, there's all kinds of things. So I was reading this, I got to tell you the story. I was reading this book about trees, about wood and trees. And in this book, they were talking about the early settlers would have these orchards, these tree orchards. The problem they had was all the trees came in at once with apples because they were one type of apple. So towards the story in the book, the guy writes that the early settlers, in order to change that, did a thing called tree thumping. What it amounted to, they would go out with a stick and they would beat the trunk of certain trees to force them into stress so they would produce fruit earlier than the other trees. Now, I've never seen this in any master gardener class. I've never seen it in any class I've ever taken, anything I've ever read, except this one book. It was written in 1965. And the guy had a lot of other interesting things in there, but that was the one that got my interest the most because I had never heard of tree thumping. Now, there were different ways to do that. You could scar the tree, but you want to stretch the tree out in some way so it produces early. And they did that so the crops would come in throughout the season rather than in all at once. And that way they didn't lose things when they would harvest. Anyway, so this book that I'm looking at, again, it's called 1001 Hints and Tips for Your Garden. By the way, we counted them the other day. I have 100 gardening books of different types of styles and times, and they all have different things to know. So it's kind of fun to go through them and pick up ideas that have been around for a long time. And this book does have 1001 tips, and some of them are pretty good. They talk about starting your plants, starting from seeds rather than having them getting plants from the nursery. And one of the things that comes up is that when you get a plant from a nursery, you don't know the condition at the nursery. If there was a bug infestation and they sprayed to get rid of the bugs, maybe they didn't get them all. And you got them. So when you start from seed, you always know what you're getting. Another thing I like is how to get better production out of your plants just by pinching off the end of a branch. I won't go into it today, but maybe when the classes start up again, if you're interested in learning more about the type of gardening that we do here in the desert, I'd love to have you attend. But right now, all you're going to get is this little tidbit on the Andy Alberti Show. One other thing about living in the desert before I get off that topic. I never had rats in our yard until last year. As construction started booming up, rats started getting displaced and they would go other places. They got into I built a greenhouse, and they got into my greenhouse and they feasted on some of my seeds. So now I store my seeds differently than I used to. One of those little things. And I get people ask me all the time, they got mice and they got rats. How do you get rid of them? So I went on YouTube to see what other people do. You can't always have your own original ideas. but you can always look and see what other people do and figure out what works for you. So one guy had a 5-gallon bucket and he filled it up halfway with water. And he had a problem with mice. He had a tremendous amount of mice in his barn. So he put this bucket out and he was catching mice in the bucket. So I thought, hey, I think I'll try that and see if I've got mice in my yard. So I filled up the bucket. Don't you know, the next day I had 5 mice in that bucket. They drowned. Because what happens is they get up on top of the bucket, but to get to the water, they got to dive in or they fall in. And then when they're in, they can't get their feet to touch the bottom to jump out. So guess what? Eventually they tire out and they drown. That may not be the most humane thing, but I like it better than a mousetrap, because mousetraps, sometimes they catch them by the leg or some other part of the body and they just suffer. And I don't like that. Okay, I want to finish up today with a little discussion about the voting coming up at Valley Electric. And Mr. Producer is going to go, oh, no, not again. But we have to talk about these things. Because if you don't know about it... not again. There he is. If you don't know about it, how do you fix it? So first thing I want to hold this up. This is my, I'm holding up a picture. This is the index to the Valley Electric bylaws. Now, you know, when people go to read bylaws, I don't care whether it's your homeowners association or wherever it is, when you go to read bylaws, there's no index. You got to guess. I like having an index because when I'm looking for a specific topic, I have an idea where to go look. And it's more interesting to do that. Anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things I see going on right now. There are 3 candidates running for Valley Electric. And I won't mention the other 2 yet, but I will. But my support, I have to disclose, I'm supporting Bill Carnes because I think he's the best candidate. I look for integrity, honesty, and fair play, and talent. I don't care what your experience is. I want you to do a good job. So I'm looking at this, the most recent Valley Electric Rural Light magazine for March 2021. It has to do with the election. And here's what's written by the CEO. I kind of like the CEO, but I think maybe I don't agree with what he wrote. So he's got this thing about Valley Electric's successful board. I'm going to tell you about the unsuccessful board that all resigned or decided not to run again because they knew they would be taken out through petition. So everybody that was on this board a year and a half ago was no longer there. So when he writes about the Valley Electric successful board, I don't know what board he's talking about. Because as far as I'm concerned, we need new faces on that board, and they shouldn't be appointed by the old board. Because the old board got taken out because of what they did. So, here's what he wrote. And let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. The fifth paragraph down, he writes, members in the districts that are up for election are urged to encourage to vote for the board member they believe would do the best job. He didn't say candidate, he said board member. Then he goes on in the next paragraph, the first sentence, to absolve himself of that sin, he starts off, to run for a director position, a candidate. Now we realize that he's asking you to vote for a board member very subtly. And I think he has to do this because, you know, they're friends. Then he says that you have to vote for the best candidate. He goes on to say, I urge you to vote for board members. I'm not so sure that that's kosher. He goes on to say in another paragraph, Valley will host a virtual candidates night for District 1 where you can ask questions and find out what is important to the candidates. Now, this question of a virtual candidates night, there's no reason they couldn't have some people in attendance. But to have an empty room, something is wrong with that position. And the meeting here says the meeting is March 11th for District 1 at 6 p.m. via Zoom. And information can be found at bea.coop elections. Well, I just got this. I just looked at it, and today is March 25th. Okay, we all make a little boo-boo here. It says our board is composed of diverse, engaged directors who effectively communicate with each other and have kept our cooperative focused on the future. The direction has been positive. Now, that doesn't really tell you anything, because in your mind, the way it's worded, you're thinking everything they're doing is positive. It doesn't mean that. It means that they like each other. It doesn't mean they're doing a good job. And when one of the directors running for office is in tears at one of the meetings because she's worked so hard, don't cry about working so hard. That's the job you took. If it's too much for you, you shouldn't be there. That's how I see it. So there were 3 candidates mentioned in this issue of the Ruralite. One of them is Michelle Caird. She's the one who had shed tears at the meeting about working so hard, and people didn't appreciate what she was doing. She was the one appointed by the previous board. Then there was Pete Gazzi. Pete Gazzi resigned because he knew the petition was going to take him out, so he resigned before the petition could do that. It even said so in the June 2019 issue of the Ruralite magazine. Those exact words are in there. And then there's the third candidate, Bill Carnes. Bill is not an incumbent. Bill is not a career politician, but he is clearly spoken. When he tells you something, you can understand what it means, and he doesn't mince words. I like that. Not only that, he believes that there needs to be better transparency at Valley Electric. And I can tell you the board has been approving new policies which do not appear to encourage transparency. And if you haven't looked at those things, I don't blame you because you don't have the time. That's why you have me. I look at them. And I can tell you this, as somebody who was barred from Valley Electric for almost 2 years for having done nothing and couldn't get a hearing before the board, I'm upset. You bet your bottom dollar I am. This board or the previous board has never invited the 5 people who got a letter of no trespass to discuss it in public. Okay, so Bill Carnes is my candidate, and I hope you vote for him. And the voting is coming up. You already got your ballot. I hope you send it in with Bill Carnes' name on it. I purposely crossed out the other 2 names so to be sure who I'm voting for. And with that, it's been a pleasure being with you today, and I am out of here.